Friend of a friend lent me this Yashica TLR a few years ago to check out. Had a stuck wine crank, and the film door latch was practically impossible to turn. I set it aside for whatever reason and got lost in a pile of other projects. When I found it again recently, I remembered him saying the camera was important to him, so I wanted to get it back in working order. Uncertain what the issue was, Occam's razor suggests the simplest explanation is usually the best one, so start with the side panel, taking the crank off to see what was locking it up. Search for a repair manual, but all I could find was these exploded diagrams. With the side panel off, I could tell things are seldom as simple as you hope. It's definitely something more complex than a stuck wine crank. Moved on to the front cover to get a better look at the shutter assembly. Similar to the side panel, it just had the lock ring on the shutter button, the leatherette, and a couple screws. Carefully remove the outside cover because it holds the controls for the shutter and aperture on the lens. With the shutter exposed, I was able to manually actuate the shutter, and once it was loose, it was able to wind a bit, but still binding up somewhere. Unable to tell what the problem was yet, the next page in the assembly manual was the lens mounting plate assembly. I took that off with the 4 screws. Give everything a quick once over. I noticed with the camera now in 2 separate pieces, the individual components worked fine on their own. The wind crank would go, and the shutter would actuate. I tried just cleaning and lubricating the copal shutter, but that wasn't the actual issue. Paying close attention to where the lens assembly and the wind crank interact, I noticed this unusual wear pattern. Made some very careful bends with some tape pliers to get the parts free floating again. Decades of use must have just pushed these components out of alignment. With it back together, that was definitely the issue. Everything was actuating again as it should. With the core of the camera working again, I started reassembly. Getting this lock spring in place for the shutter button had to be the hardest part of this entire repair. Greased the shutter and aperture gears before putting the front cover back on. Made sure the controls worked once it was in place. Got it dressed back up in the leatherette. Tested everything else as it went together. Was worried about that shutter release lock spring popping out, so when I put it back together I used a cable release to keep the shutter button in place. With the camera's core functionality working again, I moved up to the finder hood to clean the glass surfaces and the viewing mirror. The bright screen covered the focusing glass, so I didn't have to worry about messing with the etched surface. These mirrors can be really delicate, so I used air before carefully wiping it with a cloth. Finally got to the film door release. This part I kind of wish I did first because it would have made everything else a lot easier. Every time I had to open and close the camera, I thought it was going to be stuck for good, but after some cleaning and lubrication, it went together just fine. This repair wasn't as simple as I thought it'd be, but if it was easy, I wouldn't have learned anything. I've always had an affinity for twin lens reflex cameras. Excited to try this one out now that it's working again.